welcome back. Happy Friday, definitely happy Friday. For the next stretch here, we're gonna get back to data stories. The idea for assignment 4 is to get everyone on board with telling notebook-based data stories. And then the idea is going to be is to have you all explore the same question space and the same types of data sets. And so, as I've mentioned, and you might have seen if you've looked at assignment 4, we're going to be looking at coronavirus or COVID-19 data. And I posted some links to sample analyses and data sets in the assignment 4 instructions. And then the point of today is we're going to be brainstorming and workshopping your story ideas. So you can either present your story ideas like you've done with other stories for the course, or you could treat this as a pitch session to try to get other students on board with your idea. And then one reason is that, for treating it like a pitch session is for this assignment and also all future assignments in this course, you can work in groups. So you no longer have to do individual projects. So it's up to you whether you want to do that. And your choice for this assignment doesn't have to be the same as your choice for other assignments. There are a few things to keep in mind when you're presenting your ideas and giving feedback. First of all, I'd like you to think about some of the storytelling principles that we've learned about so far. So, for example, you want your story to be interesting and meaningful and relevant. One way to do that I think has been effective in your previous stories is to draw inspiration from your own lives and experiences or from your own expertise broadly construed. It's going to be easiest to tell a story about something you're familiar with in some way or that you care about in some way. And then you don't have to stick to something to only something you know about, but maybe distilling out some elements of your own life that you've been thinking about a lot, or trying to incorporate them into your story some way, as motivating rationale or plot points or details that can sometimes add spark to your story, even a data analysis based story. And then you also want to think about how you're going to organize your story. A common pitfall. Oh, sorry, Amelia. Yeah.
I can never, the hand raise tool is in a different place, I swear, on every thing. But in talking about adding personal anecdotes, I know on the last story, there were comments of I know for me, and I think one other story, it was talking in third person, and then all of a sudden we had a line of first person, how it took away credibility. So how do we balance that with telling a data story of having that data that is objective data, and then having our own story or interpretation and not taking away from
Yeah, that's a really good question. So first of all, I think the concern that at least in my view, the concern that you're referring to was you're telling a third person story, and then you have one line that kind of switches the tone, and then you move back to a third person story. So it's not that you can't mix, or you can't tell a first person story or a third person story. Either one could fit with the data stories approach. It just, you want to keep a consistent tone you can even have an inconsistent tone, but you just want to be strategic about using switches like that because it can be jarring. So if your goal is to jar the audience, then you can use tricks like changing perspective, but then you want to incorporate that into your story the points you want to make, versus if your kind of goal is to tell a smooth narrative and you're kind of jarring people out of different perspectives, that can kind of break up the flow. And I've seen, if you wanted to tell a story about like something related to you, or like pretend that it was something related to you, related to coronavirus data, I mean, not, I'm guessing many of us have experienced loss during the pandemic, and that, the pandemic has affected us in myriad ways. And so if you want to focus on that can come from a first person perspective. The data side can come from data maybe of other people in similar situations, or like stuff like that. In past years, not for this assignment, but for other assignments, I've seen like students analyze like their own Apple Watch or Fitbit data. And then that is a pretty personal story, and lots of first person is involved there. It's like trying to figure out like, why don't I sleep on Thursday nights? And like, if that's your question, there's not really like a third, I mean, I guess you could tell it in the third person, but it's a, okay. I don't know, is that helpful? All right.
Yeah, that was helpful. So it sounds like it's just making that shift like more deliberate, rather than just like something that might seem like a fluke or like a slip, or like you said, jarring. That's just like,
yeah, I think that's really the whole game, is like, you want to tell your story in an effective way, but then in addition to just like putting the information out there, it's not just about like, pumping information into someone else's brain. It's like, you have to have like a kind of psychological model, like a theory of mind sort of view of like, how is the audience going to interpret what I'm saying in the way that I'm saying it, in the context of other things I've said and the message I want to convey. And then like, are they going to interpret this thing in a way that's furthering my message or hindering my message? And there's no one right way to do that, but that's kind of the strategy. So along those same lines, like a common pitfall I've seen is like, it can be tempting to like pick some random data set and then create some random figures, and then kind of like, do a laundry list type kind of droning of, or recitation of like the analyses you did. But that is typically, it tends to be a relatively boring story. And so you want, Leah. Yeah.
I was wondering, like, in terms of the stories, I know that, I mean, clearly the pandemic, like, it's still happening. It hasn't ended yet. So when we're telling a story related to it, I'm trying to figure out like the time period for like when it should stop for the data, because what I was thinking about in particular, I'm Indian. I have a lot of relatives in India right now. So I've been keeping really closely with like the really bad crisis there. But I know that if I tell a story about it right now, that's like, it's not going to completely capture the end of the story because it's getting worse. So when approaching it that way, I'm wondering like how I would end the story or talk about how it's something that's happening right now. I'm just a little confused for like how to frame it.
Yeah, I think that could be really powerful, like current events, something that's happening in the world, maybe even like raising awareness. So I think you don't need to have you don't need to predict the future, or like, you could say, if you wanted, you could say, here's where I think this is going. But you could also conclude with like, here's what I think could be done. Here's how I think the world can help. Or like I've heard, like I've read a few articles and heard a few commentaries about like, like releasing stock, with the US kind of holding stockpiles of like AstraZeneca vaccine, which isn't used in the US right now, but like how could that help other countries, including India? And then also holding on to patents, like what's the effect of that? And, you know, it's not necessarily a simple issue. Like I understand that there are arguments about like intellectual property, but it feels different when it's like, it's people's lives, like millions or even billions of lives. How important is patent law at that point? It's like, yeah. But yeah, I could see lots of really powerful directions there. And I think, yeah, your conclusion doesn't have to be a temporal conclusion. It can be a logical conclusion or like a message you want to get out. That's totally fine. Same with any other pandemic story. It's ongoing. We don't know how things are going to like wrap up, or if, I mean, this may be an ongoing thing that we, like the new reality, we don't know.
Yeah, I like that idea actually, like ending it with a message being like, this is a call to action for what we can do to make.
Yeah.
Also, when you said that, I thought about Amelia's story about the movie theaters and how she ended that with like, okay, so here's all of this information. What's my point? And she kind of like left it up to the viewer, and somehow like that open ending still felt like a good ending to the story. So maybe there's like something there depending on what you decide to talk about.
Yeah, that's a good point. Thank you.
Yeah. Let's see. Yeah. So, okay. So it's telling you about like, you know, maybe separating out like the story parts and the data parts. So, you know, I had you do that explicitly for assignments 1 and 2, but I want you to, like, you know, the reason I did that is I wanted you to get practice separating out those things, and that's going to help your stories, you know, moving forward. And then the other thing to keep in mind is like, so, you know, the main part of your story is the story, not the data. So you want your data to back up your story, but, you know, for some stories, you might tell an effective story with 1 figure. And for another story, maybe you need 100 figures. It's like totally up to you how you organize it. Your whole thing could be a bar graph. Your whole thing, or maybe some super complicated analysis. You know, the point is not to, like, there are kind of no rules, but you want to just use data in some way to back up what you're saying and highlight your main plot points. But exactly how you do that doesn't have particular like guidelines or rules.
I had a question about that point.
Yeah.
So the assignment says that like the main way that you suggest how to tell the story is by scrolling through the Google Colab notebook with like a voiceover. Is there like, I was wondering how you can like tell an effective story without those like other visuals involved, and like if maybe we could add visuals to the notebook, or how people have done that in the past.
Yeah. I kept that suggestion in from last year. Actually, last year, so I think this is the 4th time I'm teaching this course. So the first 2 years I taught the course, almost everyone told their stories by like scrolling through their notebooks. Last year, almost no one did that. It's really up to you. If you want to paste figures into like a slideshow or do like movie clips spliced together like you've done for other stories, that's totally fine. But this time the figures should come from your analyses, not from like, you know, random things you find on the internet. And they have to be actually related to your data instead of, you know, making up results.
Okay, so just to clarify, it's not like important that we in our story explain how we extracted the data and like how we analyzed it, or like the actual data wrangling processes.
No, in fact, I would recommend not doing that, because
Okay.
I think that will detract from your story. you should submit your notebooks as part of your assignment, because I'll be interested in looking through your code, and I want to know how you did stuff. And other students, in a future assignment, someone else might want to build off of your analysis, and that's a part of this class too. That'll come in part 2, and so we'll need to share our code and data for that to happen. But for your story, it's almost always the case that you want to like communicate the high level ideas, but usually not the implementation details.
Okay, thank you.
Sure. Okay, so I think that's enough kind of guidance. Maybe we should jump into story brainstorming. So I thought today we could do story brainstorming, and then on Monday we'll talk about like implementation ideas, and then we'll see how far we get. If we need Wednesday to do that also, then we'll use Wednesday for going through implementation, and then your stories will be due like one class after we finish kind of debugging and discussing your ideas. So either Wednesday or Friday next week. Okay, so who would like to share their idea first? I can enable screen sharing too, in case you want to screen share.
I can start like talking about, so Isha and I were talking about joining up and doing a project, and actually it's ending up looking like it might be kind of similar to yours, Laya. So I don't know if we want to like link up or something. We can talk about that. But this wasn't the idea that I proposed, so Isha, like feel free to jump in and explain. But basically we were thinking about looking at the COVID crisis in India and potentially like breaking it down by sort of like town and how it's been spread across India, and like maybe comparing with like poverty statistics, socioeconomic status, like other factors, and sort of seeing like which places are being hit the most, like how it sort of escalated so suddenly, and like where that's happening. And Isha, I know you mentioned like you have some family there, so I don't know if you want to elaborate or anything.
Yeah, so this is kind of all just like stuff that I've heard from my family. They're all doctors, so like they're all like pretty much at the front lines of this. But I know like a month ago everything was like completely fine. Like my mom visited and she was like, it's all fine there. And like they were talking about how like they run like a private clinic, and they were like, oh, like nobody wants our vaccines because you have to pay for them, and we just like have a bunch of extra vaccines that nobody really wants to get from us. So I was thinking maybe like I have to look more into this, but like the private versus the public vaccine stuff, and how like that is also affected who gets vaccines. And I know the supply now is like way shorter than it like has to be. But the story was like the changing situation, like how it went from everyone thinking it was just fine and like no one wanting to get vaccines to how it is now.
Yeah, so, oh, sorry.
Oh, sorry for
Oh.
talking. I'd love to jump in and join in with you guys, because it looks like we're thinking about more or less the same thing. But yeah, I'll let Professor Manning give some ideas.
Well, yeah, I mean, yeah, so if you want to join up as a group, that's great. And if you want, yeah, I mean, you can have two stories that are about similar things or even the same thing. That's sometimes interesting to have two different takes on like the same sort of story. I think both of the kind of inroads to your story are interesting. So one is like or at least that I'm taking away is like, one is like how like what's the timeline and the spread. So basically kind of like the growth of the like problem. And then the second piece is the like lack of solution. So like shortages of vaccines, maybe people don't want to get vaccines because of, well, cost, or yeah, who knows, maybe cost is a primary barrier, but that could be interesting to look into. So like what's the like, I guess, bottleneck almost, and or maybe like it's a new variant, vaccines aren't effective. So like, you know, we want to, I think that could be interesting to unpack. And then, so if there's I guess, if that leads to like a logical solution, like, okay, the solution is more vaccines are needed. How do you get more vaccines? Like some other country has to step in, or I know India is like a big pharmaceuticals manufacturer. So like, can India like, I don't know anything about pharmaceutical manufacturing. So like, I don't know why there's a limit to vaccines, but like, presumably there's some reason why there is. And so maybe that's interesting to explore. And I mean, I'd love to know, like, okay, what's the way, like if there's a way forward, that could be a positive message. It could also be like, it could be framed as like a social justice story, like who's being left behind in, you know, 2021 and why, and what are the underlying issues. Yeah, I think there are a lot of interesting directions here. One, when you mentioned the COVID spread, I was thinking like a choropleth map where you have like a timeline. It looks like animated. Okay, here's the hot spot, and then you see it like spreading out. I don't know if it'll look like that, but that could be really effective. The New York Times has published some animations also of like the spread of the virus using kind of network plots. And those have been really interesting and compelling also. So that's I don't know if you'll have data at that resolution, but that could be potentially interesting too.
Yeah, definitely. I think Isha, you said there was like by the town or district or something. So maybe depending on like how granular the size of like those boundaries would be, I guess would impact like if it would be a meaningful map. But I think that would look cool. Yeah.
I was also thinking something interesting is like we could have a visualization for the spread of the virus, but another big issue that's happening is there are a lot of like false negatives happening for testing. So a lot of people are getting it and it's like kind of undetected from the data. And I know this just like anecdotally. So I'm trying to figure out like how we could potentially like estimate how many people could have false negatives, because
Yeah.
with this new variant, I mean, it's all like assumptions here. We're not completely sure with this new variant. Some of the old tests weren't working properly to detect it, and because of that, it really impacted like the spread. So yeah, I just feel like there's a lot of room for things that we can detect. So any advice on like what to focus on instead of focusing on like 10 different things related to the situation?
That's both scary and interesting, but if we focus on the interesting piece of it, I mean, one thing to potentially look in, just one idea would be, you know, if there's many tests at least have like reported false negative rates or false positive rates. So it's sometimes called like the sensitivity or specificity of the test. Maybe maybe there's compiled data about the sensitivity and specificity of different types of tests on different variants. I also don't know like what is tracked, like, you know, if you have like rates of infection or you know, per town per day or something like that. Like, I don't know if you have which variant do people get. I haven't seen data on like which variant people are getting by, you know, well, I haven't actually seen any data on that, but I know I've like seen articles, okay, like this strain is active in like South Africa or Brazil or Europe or but like, I don't know how that's tracked, but maybe there's data on that. If you do have an estimated false negative rate, you could like do some sort of correction of your values. Like you could say, okay, what proportion of the population is testing positive, and then augment that by the false negative rate or your expected false negative rate, and maybe adjust by false positive rate also, and then say like, okay, if we scale this up to the full population, how is this disease spreading? And that could be interesting.
I thought when you guys were talking about like the vaccine hesitancy and like how it relates to cost, what came to mind for me was the like Twitter scraper package and maybe how you could like measure public opinion through that. I'm not sure how complicated that is, but it could be a cool thing to look at, like how many tweets like refer to cost in like negative ways pertaining to the vaccine.
That's actually, yeah, that's a great idea. It reminded me of something else I saw related to a lot of Facebook posts with like hashtags related to India being taken down. These hashtags are related to like having the current prime minister resign. So I feel like there's like so much opportunity to detect information, but we'll just never really know the full extent because like maybe they're false negatives for tests or like posts have been taken down. So it's hard to estimate. So not that we have to like focus on this in particular, but my question here is kind of like, how would we estimate the amount of data that we can't track, but we can assume is there? Like, would it be wise to work off of like educated assumptions?
I mean, these are the right questions to ask. I don't know the right answers. But these are good things to think about. I think when you're presenting the data, there are kind of two strategies that I've seen that are effective about potentially incomplete data. So one would be to present the data you have and acknowledge where it might be incomplete and how that might affect the conclusions or the messages that you're drawing or you're conveying. And then the second kind of general strategy would be to do some sort of correction by making assumptions, but then you have to be upfront about what your assumptions are so that you're kind of being accurate in how you're conveying things. So if you want to say like, I've corrected the values in this way, I think that's reasonable to do, but you want to be clear about how you're doing that so that you're not, misleading people. But there's no like, I mean, if you test 10% of the population and then you're generalizing to 90%, you don't have the information for 90% of the population. So you can make assumptions that 90% is like 10%, but you won't have the ground truth. So, you can either choose to only draw conclusions about the 10% you do have data for, or you could generalize, but then that requires making assumptions, which, that's kind of the nature the nature of the game here. Yeah, but this seems like a really promising direction. Other things to maybe think about are like, so there's like, how does the virus spread? What can we do to stop the spread? But then that has, so there's the virus itself, but then that has costs of lives and, I mean, people's lives, people's health, people like economic cost, relationships, if a lot of resources are devoted to dealing with, hospitals or pandemic difficulties, what is not getting those, areas are not getting those resources. So there's a lot of like indirect costs or, costs and consequences that could be also interesting to explore. Like often those are what impacts individual people most. Like if your family member, it's like there's the numbers, but then if your family member gets COVID, then that is what matters to you. It becomes real. And then like if your college experience is turned remote, like that's what matters. It doesn't, it's different to have a statistic versus like, okay, how does it actually impact the people in like, there might be a way to kind of reach your audience too. Okay. Any other comments, thoughts, ideas here?
I think for me, it'll probably just depend on like what the data is. Like all these things are interesting to me. So yeah, just kind of like as it unfolds.
Cool, that sounds great. Yeah, and on Monday when we talk about like implementation and stuff like that, then it'll be good to have tracked down some data sets. Maybe we'll play around with some of them, and I think that will be useful. Okay. And I think Amelia, Hannah, and Nathan, you mentioned are you all in the same group? So we have two groups this time. Cool. Does one of you want to talk about your story?
I can talk about our idea a little bit. Basically, I heard I was at home, which is like an hour away when the big like COVID outbreak happened on campus. And I was actually like talking to my dad about it, and I was like, well, it's a good thing we're isolated. And he sent me to this article basically saying that there was a study that looked at the strain at like LSU or some university of COVID, and then connected it like 3 weeks later with a strain that hit a local nursing home. And so like it was kind of showing how behavior on college campuses impacts like the broader community. And I've always kind of wondered if our COVID outbreak had a similar like impact or like ripple effect on the communities around us. Just like because we're pretty isolated. So I think it would be interesting to know one way or the other. So Nathan and Amelia and I like are trying to look at counties and whether the spike in COVID cases in February in Grafton County, because of Dartmouth College, majority because of Dartmouth College, had anything to do or had any sort of downstream impact on the COVID cases in bordering counties. And there's like 9 bordering counties in Vermont and New Hampshire.
Yeah, cool. So this could be another like kind of choropleth map spreading sort of thing. One idea that I had also is like, I don't know, there's like University of New Hampshire, University of Vermont, and then like, other smaller colleges in Vermont and New Hampshire that, I mostly follow the Dartmouth cases because like we're at Dartmouth, but I'm sure all of these colleges are doing tracking, and it could be interesting to compare like, okay, for similar like geographic areas, is Dartmouth doing a good job? Are we not doing a good job? Potential other direction there. Then there's also, there's the recent decision to require all students to be vaccinated when they return to campus. presumably there's, you know, lots of thinking went into that decision. You know, I don't know if that could be tied in somehow, but it's, you know, thought maybe ideas about how does how do vaccinated people spread COVID, or do they, or is it only about only about interactions between, you know, Dartmouth community members, that we want to get back to in-person interactions and in-person teaching. So, you know, I don't know if that decision might tie in or be interesting to explore, or like, what are the precautions Dartmouth has taken, which ones have been effective, you know, what went wrong in this, you know, this outbreak case, and why, and, you know. And then also, like, tying, I think it could be potentially interesting also to like tie into your your experiences as Dartmouth students during this. Like, is there, like, do you feel blame from the community? Do you feel responsible? Do you feel like that's fair or not fair? And then, like, what are the challenges of being a student during this time? Like, you know, there's some balance between, like, okay, what are the costs and benefits of any particular action? And, you know, yeah, those are different for everyone, but maybe there are some messages to think about, or to you know, help like relate, or help your audience relate to your story, if you can tie in these sorts of kind of personal thoughts or ideas.
No, definitely. I think that there's like a lot of emotion involved, just considering the fact that it's our home school, and like if like our original study kind of shows that there was an external impact, I think that will definitely be like an emotional story in and of itself. If it doesn't, then that's like a different conversation that might come out of it. I'm going to be really interested to see what the data shows.
And something like, I don't know if you guys have already seen this, but I know that it was kind of like big news around like with students when it came out. But Julia Griffin, the town manager, she maybe like a month or two ago published an article about how like Dartmouth college parties on Halloween were related to nursing home deaths that happened. And a lot of people were like, I think, angry about it because they were like, there wasn't an outbreak on Halloween, and like it was very clearly like the staff at the nursing home had COVID, and that is what caused it. So that maybe something.
Huh.
Yeah, that's pretty interesting. But yeah, I don't know how we where we would go for some of that data. Do you know each of like any of that exists?
Well, they like publish the data for like what cases happened when, right? So you'd be able to tell like how many there were in the months around. I think it might all be in like you might be able to find some sources in her article. I don't know if it was all just like fiction, but yeah.
That's crazy.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's a really cool idea. I bet we could like start with the article and work backward, like see what places they cite, see if we can find. I don't know if it's the US counties data set, but I know I've seen data sets that have tracked cases to particular areas, like a prison, for instance. So like we could maybe find that for a nursing home in New Hampshire or Vermont, and kind of do something there. That would actually be really interesting. And then depending.
We could also.
Oh yeah, yeah.
Sorry, we could also just probably call them and ask. I don't know if that's cool, or if we're supposed to be like generating data from larger data sets, which we could also do, but it would be interesting.
No, I mean, first primary sources, that's a great way to, that's awesome. Yeah. If you want to do that, that's, you don't have to, but that sounds cool.
That's a
It
really
all, yeah. It also like it, I mean, the like unfair blaming of students, it reminds me of like, okay, classic town and gown, like conflict. I mean, that's happens in many college towns, but you know, Dartmouth has a long history of this. I mean, it's an old school, so that makes history long, but you know, that could be interesting. And then also like it's like to what, I mean, it seems to tie into like generational blame. Like it's a kind of classic example of like, I mean, a nursing home is literally like old people blaming young people for their problems. So like, if that's not fair, that could be a really powerful message. And, you know, that could be a neat direction.
yeah.
Yeah,
Depending
also-
on like, oh, you go.
I was just gonna say another like piece of context that you guys like may have seen but may have not. So just in case, I think like last summer, like before students came back to campus, there was a similar op-ed where like I don't know exactly who it was, like within Hanover administration stuff, posted this op-ed about like, you know, students are selfish, we can't bring them back, they're gonna jeopardize our town. And then there was like also backlash, I think, from someone in the D being like, you can't just like blindly say that like we don't have like any right to this space, or like a lot of people like need the resources here, or like etc. So it would be interesting, I think, to see like if you followed that story arc of like this persistent, like since basically the start of the pandemic, like clash between like town and school, and then like what does the data actually show about the outbreak. I think that would be super interesting.
And I was here this summer because I had like a lease. So I know a lot of what happened because I was like here through it. But they passed a ton of like ordinances that were just like specifically directed at students that actually were probably not beneficial to helping keeping COVID cases down. Like just banning like specific streets, like or, like that you can't have outdoor gatherings, which just like moved gatherings inside, which is probably worse for COVID. So maybe like some of that stuff as well.
I think they also tried to put specifications about like renters can't do this, but owners can. And then people were like, that's literally just classes. I'm like, you absolutely cannot do that.
Mhm.
Wow.
Yeah, it would be cool to see like some of the timeline here, like if we can find the article, cases, ordinances, and then cases, and then depending on how much time / bandwidth we have, it could also be cool. And I guess depending on what we find also, if there's like other notable outbreaks in other areas, or like from whether it's from like a different New England college or like a nursing, like some other kind of cases, and show like we're no more at fault than like there have been worse outbreaks that were being blamed. Something like that. Yeah, we
I think
definitely I saw the summer article and was like just kind of like deflated going into fall term, like no one wants us here.
I think your point about outdoor versus indoor gatherings is really interesting, and like we could almost like send out a survey based on that and be like, have you gathered more outdoors or indoors? Like, what's your proclivity to being inside versus outside? And then look at data saying like that outdoor gatherings are safer. I think that would be really interesting too.
And also like you could maybe ask like, was the reason you gathered inside like because you didn't want to like be caught gathering at all? Because like I know that, so I was here last like spring because I like similar thing, I already had a house and I was here, and there was not really anybody else here, and you know I wouldn't have done it anyways, but like definitely there was this like idea that like if you wanted to see like two other people, you were gonna have it be inside because you don't want like your neighbors snitching on you to Dartmouth, because like there were these angry emails being sent out by like Dean Lively. So like I would be super curious to see if like people who were here maybe like summer and fall, like once there's a little more like outdoor stuff, like if they were, you know, afraid to be caught or something.
I mean, this is a really interesting, I mean, non-COVID implications of this stuff too. Like, what are the unintended consequences of like rules and regulations that, like, I mean, in this case, like they're directly backfiring. But yeah, I mean, that could be another interesting direction. It almost feels like a separate story, but
or like, have you had symptoms that you haven't reported on your TSA because for fear of like repercussions, stuff like that? Looking at the different types of policies that might have backfired.
Yeah, that's really interesting.
yeah.
I had food poisoning in the fall, and so I like was like vomiting and put that on my TSA, and then I had to go into isolation housing. I was like, I literally have 24-hour food poisoning. This is ridiculous. And then I made sure I never put down a symptom again, because it was like it's like every little thing exists. Food, like there's other things other than COVID. So interesting point.
One of the policies I kind of heard about that was negatively affecting people, I mean, amongst many of them, I think, was related to like, if you get in trouble for like a COVID violation, even if it's like not proven that you actually did something wrong, you have to leave campus within like 24 hours. And that's a rule that only could benefit privileged people who can have another place to live within 24 hours. So I was wondering if that's also something that you guys kind of considered. I'm not completely familiar with the issue. I've been away from campus for a long time, but just a thought.
Wow. Yeah. There's so many dimensions to this. I mean, I think with both stories, there's like there are like analogs between both stories, I think, that are interesting, but it's like there's the logistics and the like, or not logistics, the logic of how the spread is happening and why it's happening. But then it seems like there's like the interesting stuff, or a lot of the interesting stuff, like that's only like, it seems like that's maybe a setup, but the interesting stuff might be the consequences. Like, I mean, unintended policy consequences, who's to blame, is the blame fairly allocated? Those seem, it just seems like there's a lot of who's getting affected. Like, are the people who are to blame, who are responsible for spread, the same people who are being negatively infected by this or affected by the spread?
I feel like we could almost begin with like broader concepts and like funnel it into our like the actual data story. Like, with people are pretty upset about some of the policies Dartmouth has enforced, like some of them are classist, some of them are this, like, and then we get blamed for this, and then here's the specific like Halloween case or whatever, and then we go into the data on it and be like, that one was wrong or right, whatever it was. We don't know yet.
Yeah, that seems like a really neat direction. Another thought I'm having, like, given the complexities of these issues, it's going to be tricky to like pick and choose what are the most relevant pieces and how can you like distill it down to a 5-minute story. So I think there's going to be a lot of pruning that happens when you actually turn it into a story that that you want to it'll just be strategic. So, one story doesn't have to tell you every aspect of this super complicated issue. It just like, you might want to drill down into one thing or a small number of things so that your message is clear. But then maybe you could allude to additional nuance or not. You could just leave it to separate stories.
Or we could like, I just flip-flop, but we could end it with that, like, here's what we found, like, we didn't actually cause these outbreaks, and like these types of assumptions are leading to policies that might actually be like classist and or whatever, and leave that like open-ended question of like, are these policies effective or are they like I don't know, disproportionately impacting certain groups.
That sounds really interesting. Yeah, that could be really effective. And then the other, I guess the flip side to ending with it, so I think that could be a really powerful message. It's also important, like you don't want to come across as like making excuses or whining as the narrator. And so that's just a balance when you're putting the story together. You want to like, telling, I guess, adopting a more objective tone. Obviously, none of these stories are fully objective, but you know, kind of focusing on like, okay, here are the facts, and I'm presenting the story in a really fact-driven way and logic-driven way, as opposed to like, here's how I feel as a student. So if your message is like, we're not to blame as students, then since the narrators of the story are going to be students, I think it'll be effective if you can like tell the story in a way that's like a little removed from your identity and say like, okay, here are the, like, let's explore this important issue. Here's like the facts, here's where it led. What can we conclude from this? How do we interpret this finding? And then, you know, move on. And then what conclusions do we draw? And then kind of let your audience, I mean, you want to constrain the conclusions that your audience will draw, but sometimes leaving some of the messaging a little bit unsaid so that the audience fills in the gaps themselves, that can be effective, because then it's like the message comes from your audience, or it feels like the message is coming from like your viewer's brain instead of from your brain, even though that's not, you know, how it actually happens. But you know, you tend to trust your own thoughts more than other people's thoughts.
So maybe like keeping it, like trying to refrain from using the first person as a Dartmouth student would be more effective than being like, we as Dartmouth students have been like impacted by that.
It could be, yeah. I'm thinking that it might be. Yeah, I don't know. I mean, you could try different tones and see what seems to work, but that's the impression that I'm getting just from this conversation. But I guess it'll depend how it comes together ultimately. But cool. Okay. Well, these are really interesting ideas. So we have a few minutes left in class. We can either end early today, or you know, happy to brainstorm ideas about where to find data sets, or or we could just do that on, you know, go do that on Monday. Would anyone like help brainstorming data sets or thinking about analyses, or would you like
I don't know
early
with anybody else,
yeah.
but like I haven't looked at the links on assignment 4 yet or anything, so I would probably want to like look at that a little bit on my own and see what questions I have before we talk about it. But also, if people have questions, I'm super like happy to keep talking.
Is there like a best way to look for data sets? I've just been like Googling. Is there like...
That's perfect. Yeah, the CDC and Johns Hopkins has a repository of like COVID related data. The New York Times has a COVID data set that they're keeping updated. Any of the, like, you know, as long as it's like a, you know, national or international organization that's like, you know, giving data in a way, you know, a reputable organization that's giving you access to the actual data, I think that's a reasonable place to find data. But yeah, Googling is great. That's how I often find data sets. Okay, so let's end a little early. And so on Monday, we'll talk about kind of implementation details. So if you found data sets, we can talk about how to analyze them. If there's like a missing data set, like I'd love to find this type of data set, how could I do that? We could brainstorm that. If you want to like write some code, and we could either start with code you've already written, we could generate code from scratch. We can start to work on the implementation details, or if there's some plot you're like, I want to make this type of plot, how do I do it? We can discuss that too. So we'll do that on Monday. All right, everyone, have a great weekend, and see you Monday. Take care.
Thank you.